Juneteenth is a holiday that was known by very few people out of the state of Texas for decades that followed, the order that created it. Juneteenth was created from an order issued by a Union General, Order Number 3 in the state of Texas, which read, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere." Interesting that the order specifically references absolute equality of personal rights. The reason I mention that is because following the issuance of this order on June 19th, 1865, the years that followed would find people of power against people of color using what would commonly be referred to as Jim Crow laws to enslave them right back where they were. Now, let's take a look for just a moment at the 13th Amendment that was passed approximately 6 months after the issuance of Order Number 3. The 13th Amendment is commonly referred to as the law or the amendment that abolished slavery. But let's take a look at the language of that, shall we? "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." You see, after the amendment was passed or signed by Congress in 1864, the state legislatures spent most of 1865 debating the 13th Amendment until it was finally ratified by enough states in December of 1865. And immediately thereafter, we saw Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow laws were finding this particular exception and taking advantage of it. The way to do that would be to create a whole bunch of laws that only African Americans could violate. That would include things like walking on the same sidewalk as a person of color, drinking from a water fountain, and don't you even dare think, if you're an African American, that you could marry a person who was anything other than your color. Then in the 1930s, we saw the federal government do pretty much the same thing, except this time through the conduit of drugs or narcotics that were being consumed during that time period. There was a large population of non-white, I guess, people who consumed cannabis. And so you would be able to put them back into slavery if you caught them consuming these drugs. Not because these individual drugs necessarily formed any kind of threat to the public, but more because it was a pretext to taking control of portions of the population. Then in 1970, 71 or so, we saw Richard Nixon do essentially the same thing with his famous declaration of war on drugs. And for him, the pretext was that these individual drugs represented the greatest threat to American society. But more to the point, it gave him the authority to use federal resources to investigate otherwise adversarial opponents in the political arena by using the modern drug laws. And then during the time period that followed, between 1970s to today's date, almost 50 years later, we see the greatest population ever enslaved in American prisons. Many of those individuals there on nonviolent offenses, specifically for the consumption of cannabis. I come here today from the beautiful state of Colorado, outside, listening to the birds chirp, in appreciating the freedom that I have. And in this state, that includes the freedom to consume cannabis legally and not be enslaved if you happen to get caught with it. Let's take the opportunity to celebrate Juneteenth at the same time recognizing that there are a lot of people still enslaved because of antiquated drug laws. Let's continue to support the legalization, the decriminalization, and more importantly, the modernization of America's cannabis laws so that we can reduce the population of people who are enslaved by those rules. My name is Ted Corliss. Enjoy your freedom. Ted Corliss with NewsMunchies.com. Be well.